Ray Baker with the Baseball Stadium District. The brief history of our involvement really centered around, as I would elaborate on, probably a quantified 28 to 30 months of true concentrated effort, which dealt with the land acquisition, financing issues, design and construction of the stadium. Unfortunately, 23 years later, I guess we had to wrestle with the issue of the extension, which took about 3.5 years to get to a resolution, and I'm happy to say that we got to a resolution after lengthy debate and with both sides probably walking away a bit nauseated with the arrangement that we reached. With that said, I think when we capitalize and look at the overall extent of baseball, I think from our perspective, it expands a good 40 years when you look at the involvement of Denver and what initial people brought to the table. The stadium process itself was pretty a micro of the overall relationship. So with this video, I get to reflect on a lot of years, but really when you think about it, I think our involvement was quantifiable in about 2.5 years, and you just couldn't trip and you couldn't make a mistake. Unfortunately, there were other bigger issues in a positive way to get it done that were led by thousands of people before. And you talk about Mr. Housem, and you talk about John DeQ, and you talk about the Oakland A's, and you talk about all the concepts that were ahead that people kept pushing before us. That laid the groundwork, and that got it done. As we talked previously, I think I have worked with the legislation more than any one person. That I can unfortunately agree to say that I can say that, because that's kind of nauseating in itself. But with that said, I think the legislation has been the guiding light that has made it work. And the reason we know that is we know pretty much all pieces of legislation throughout the country, because we've studied it to try to see best practices, and every time we come back to say ours was a pretty good law. So I think in the end what was our guiding light was having a good principle framework, and second was having extremely talented board members that brought value to the table, i.e. the Max Wiley story about refinancing the bonds and saving $19 million, or be it Penn Tate on large construction projects, or Dean Qualmy, who had done power plants for $5 billion. Those got us over hurdles that we probably didn't realize how big the hurdle was. And then we dealt with challenges along the way that ownership shifts that we had to deal with. Fortunately, we were too preoccupied with what we had to do at the time. And because of the legislation, we had X amount of dollars. So it was pretty well mapped out for us, as well as the cost overruns. And the second tier to that is baseball really allowed football to be bought and copied, and at the end of the day there was one tax that provided two facilities. And I can tell you throughout the country there hasn't been one like it.
So one of the things in terms of dealing with the legislation, the appointment process allowed for two entities, the Stadium Authority and the Baseball Commission. Stadium Authority looking out for the best interests of the public and protecting the public purse, and the Baseball Commission, which was to sell the public on the idea of voting for the issue. And there was some concern on behalf of the governor that the appointments were going to be, to the Stadium Authority, were going to be made by various individuals other than the governor. And he had indicated that he had discomfort with that because that was one of the primary powers of the governor. And we felt that generally appointments, especially by politicians, tend to be payback for things that people have done in campaigns or whatever. So we were very specific in the legislation about there needed to be someone with public finance experience, there needed to be someone with construction experience, there needed to be someone with contract negotiation experience. How did that impact the decisions, or how did that either help or hinder the board in their abilities to perform their duties?
I don't think it hindered it because of the expertise that was called for by the law. You basically got people that could perform those type of services when needed. And when you build a project at the time that was $200 million, there weren't too many $2 million projects being built in this country, let alone in this state. So with that said, having the expertise was critical. These were people I had never met. So here you are put into a room and you got to solve this big puzzle. As I told Governor Romer, the largest ballpark I'd ever been in was in Pueblo. So my experience was very minute compared to the Max Wileys or the, I think the fact that it was non-political was critical. So what has gone on around the state or around the country with others is they are political. And I think that causes some issues and some stress on what is the better outcome. So I think in the legislation, looking back, what I think was really important is that it came with neutrality and talent. I'm not including myself in that, but I'm including a lot of other people who brought, and I'm forgetting some people because it goes back 25 years, but you know, we had Deborah Brody that knew real estate, we had Max Wiley that knew financing, we had Penn Tate when we were talking about larger projects and his experiences. We had John McHale that knew contractual law, it goes on and on. So I think that was an intended favorable consequence at the end of the day.
Well, I know also one of the things is how many years you've served and you've donated your time, and how many years you've served as chair. And what we're finding is, of course, the legislation as it was drafted would have never passed the legislature if there would have been a funding mechanism attached to it to reimburse board members or to reimburse legal counsel or any of those things. Can you talk about what kind of a challenge that presented to you and your group?
I think early on, if we didn't have the services of numerous people in the business community that supported it, I mean, going back to Bill Daniels and to the political powers, there didn't seem to be a partisan angle as we deal with today. I mean, people have a hard time understanding that you could actually have a House and a Senate that agreed with a Republic or a Democratic governor, and that's unheard of today, I guess, sadly. So I think there was a buy-in from a lot of people long before this became law, and it wouldn't have been where it was today. Let's say, for example, if we were involved in the campaign, I think that would have caused great grief and great concern. So how much thought was given to that, I don't really know because I wasn't part of that process. But looking in hindsight, I think that ended up being a tremendous value. That could have been a major detriment. And the appointment process of the expertise, I think it speaks for itself with the people that were appointed that I thought brought a lot of value to it. And I don't recall it being slanted one way or the other on a political affiliation. So it really came with that expertise.
So how many years have you served on the board, and how many years as chair?
Way too many. I think I've served since they started, which was around 89 or 90. And I became chair by default when John left abruptly and got to deal with that issue of moving through that process, which had its challenges, but in the end, the aggravation was well worth it.
So how many hours would you say that you...
I would try not to contemplate that. But it's really been, I think the emphasis of the board is not to be really noticed. I think the job should be that just maintain and not lose the value of the stadium, which when I look around the country, I think we've done a reasonably good job of that, and I think that was important to protect the integrity of the building.
So you had this responsibility to get the stadium built, yet you didn't really have any funds coming in, and you had to arrange for the bonds, you had to figure out a design, you had to get
Right.
legal assistance. How did you do
Pull
that?
that off.
Well, I would say that you also had a community spirit that you have to look to the baseball commission, who created some energy for that. And so you had some people that basically said, I'm willing to donate my time. I don't know that that would have happened if it were just a board that was basically seeking free legal, accounting, administrative. I mean, CHAFA provided all the administrative costs for the first couple of years. There was free legal provided. CHAFA provided all the administrative costs to oversee that. The chamber was supportive. It was a collective effort, but I still think it was grassroots that started it 10, 15, 20 years ahead, or it wouldn't have gotten done. If it was a brand new idea, I think it really would have been hard. And it was far from a brand new idea, because you started discussing this concept in the 70s, and I think it probably took that much painstaking time to get to where we are today.
But there was a lot of hard work done during your first few years there, and there wasn't money to pay for it.
There wasn't, but I think, to Kathy's point, the people on the board provided a tremendous amount of asset at no charge. I mean, here we are with a banker, people who have done contractual law before, a free law firm, so to speak. Basically, the dividends paid off, but it may not have if it would have failed. And I think you had, as I said, you had 1,000 people supporting it. And they were kind of like literally almost everywhere. I mean, Joe Blake, and you talk about Sam Simplizio. It goes on and on and on. And so that's why when we look at our role was pretty confined, and you have to look at all the years before as well as what's gone on after, or we wouldn't be here today.
But you had a short time to make it to the finish line.
We
And
did.
You had to pick a site. Tell us about the site selection process.
Well, I'm happy to hear that there's so many people that actually supported it. I don't remember it at that time that there was all that support, because you two know too well what we were dealing with at 20th and Blake, but we had other sites that didn't really fall into place. Looking back now, we get far more credit for picking that site than we probably deserve, because one should realize it was an affordable site. It also provided us with a lot of secondary parking that has now been far needed than we ever thought it was going to be needed. If you'll recall, there's a lot of criticism that we didn't have enough parking, and as it all turned out, we got to play off everybody else's parking. And since then, it's even played off even better. So there was dumb luck with the economy and the sales tax taking such a jump and getting secondary parking. So I think there was a lot of luck in it that panned off. The other two sites, you could say there was a lot of favoritism toward the Pepsi Center site for a variety of reasons. I'd give a lot of credit to the architects who really talked about foot traffic. And remember, the only other urban site isn't quite as urban as this one was Baltimore. And they had just finished Baltimore, or were finishing it at the time, and they relied a lot on foot traffic. And they said you can really play off the foot traffic. It didn't take any genius to realize that Spear and Auraria were a challenge for foot traffic. So I think that fell into place, that we didn't really realize how much of a benefit that would be in the end.
So we have a great stadium now. How did we get that design? Is there a story behind that?
I would say the story is there was a 26-year-old designer who was kind of the subsection of the Populous team, or the HOK team. He has since gone on to do greater and more wonderful things in the stadium world with a company called 360. I can't recall his full name, but he was a 26-year-old who basically created what I call the old look. But then there was another committee behind that involved the city and a lot of the neighborhood, where the neighborhood came together and said, let's keep the historical preservation look, and that was a whole new other look that really prevailed. As I say, we probably spent $10 or $15 million making it look old, and that actually added a lot of value. I would say that was good hindsight by these different architects and different community leaders, which, by the way, we played no role in. They just really helped us create kind of what I would call as the old stadium look. And at the end of the day, we got lucky, and that design has held well through it all. But I think Baltimore, the executive director from Baltimore came out and spent 3 days with us and told us everything he did wrong in Baltimore. And that was a godsend to us. To the board, he basically said we didn't have wide enough concourses, we didn't tilt the seats, we blocked a lot of the view to the field with permanent concessions. So it goes on and on with some of those things that you normally wouldn't have gotten with anybody with an ego. And he came out and said, don't do this, this, and this. Do this, this, and this, and you're going to make it that much better. They sound like small issues, but it really defined a lot of what I would say the fan experience. And did we have any part of that? No, 0 part. He's the one who came out to us, and that gentleman's name is Bruce Hoffman. And he's a phenomenal guy that ended up saying, basically got dressed in front of us and said all the things that he did wrong. A lot of people wouldn't do that. And so that's a story that never has really gotten told. I don't think we would have the stadium in as well received as it is. And I don't know where we stand nationally, but locally it's played well. At the end of the day, it played well, and I think a lot of that is just good fortune.
I know at the time that we were dealing with this issue, of course, Colorado was in a deep recession. We certainly, who we thought was going to be the logical owner didn't end up being the logical owner. Part of the job that was given to the Stadium Authority was to go out and do community educational meetings. What kind of things were you hearing at those meetings? Were you thinking this issue would pass or not pass?
I was convinced it would not pass, but I was only convinced by the polls and everybody telling me that, or telling us that this thing was not going to likely pass. At the end of the day, I don't know that there was really that kind of, what I would say, this movement for baseball. How much I would give the credence to the polling obviously proved to be false, and it reversed itself as far as what the projected trends were, and it all came out to be a happy ending at the end of the day. As they say, the soccer moms carried the day, if that were in fact the truth, which it appears it was. There was little interest when we went out to the public, per se. I wouldn't say there was a gigantic amount of interest. It created a little more, depending on certain counties. We went to certain counties, no one showed up.
Wow.
So, and I don't think you would be surprised to know that was Boulder, who had 0 interest. And we would show up to public meetings, because I think the legislation called for a public meeting in every county,
Right.
which I think I attended. At the time we had 6 counties, and I think I attended 5 out of the 6. And I know I attended Boulder, and we met the janitor who said he was against baseball. So that was, I still remember actually walking up, and I said, well, we must have had the wrong date. And they go, oh no, you have the right date. There's nobody here. And as you know, they voted against it.
No, they voted.
Oh, was it Adams that?
Yeah,
there
it
was
was
two-
Adams that
Yeah.
voted against it. Yeah.
They barely voted for it.
Is that what it was?
Barely, yeah.
I get confused, because I think Boulder voted against football, but I can't
Maybe,
remember.
but Adams voted
Yeah.
for it, yeah.
Is that right? Adams voted for it, but Boulder,
Against football, yeah. I think
yeah,
you're right.
that's what I
For
remember.
football.
So as far as that process, I think it was still the right process, because I think it created, even though it wasn't necessarily attended by thousands, it created credibility, and that there was a transparent process at the end of the day, and it was copied on football. Now, football was a different story in the fact that you had thousands that would show up
Right.
for whole different reasons, meaning they just wanted to tell you that they were a fan, and they didn't really want to tell you anything related to the lease. But I don't think that we'd have a football stadium without the baseball legislation.
Wow.
And I would go as far as to say that because, as you'll recall, baseball or football vote barely also passed. I think it was by 5 or 5.5%.
And that was right after they won the Super Bowl.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were 8-0. So it wasn't a mandate about football. So I think, I was reflecting back because we've been pulled into this Arizona Diamondback dispute, pulled in the fact that they want a lot of information about how they could resolve their dispute. And the legislation guidelines are something we sent them and said, we also
It's
did.
kind of a helpful hammer.
I think it was, but I think they've missed it, unfortunately, there, because they now have deferred maintenance. And now that you have deferred maintenance, you've got a big capital issue. So if that was probably the one prevailing factor. The second prevailing factor was that and I know we got criticized for this, was to have a triple net lease. And we were criticized for it because we could allow money on the table, which we likely did, but we eliminated all risk. So the theory there was the team could reap the benefit, but they could also reap the downside. And so now we can say how profitable it is, but at the time we didn't know what the risk was. And by the way, in 98, 99, and 2000, when they were losing games, it came with greater risk. So I'm not sure of all the economics, but that was the model that Baltimore also helped us with. So those were the lessons learned.
Yeah, so the legislation passed, and you're gearing up to build a stadium, and then you hear about the ownership group having problems. How did you feel about that?
We got pulled into it only slightly. We were so deep into what we were doing at the time that if we had stopped, we probably wouldn't have acquired the land. We wouldn't have been ready on the architectural side. So we never really were cast in the middle of it, per se, meaning it got to a resolution by other powers, not by ours, per se. We tried to stay out of the fray, so to speak, which I think we did a pretty successful job of staying out of it. I didn't know, and our board didn't know how it was going to play itself out. And since then, as you know, we've had other changes that we got to deal
It's the only
with.
thing that's been consistent is change, right?
Yes. And unfortunately, I'm the only one that has experienced it.
All of it.
Yes. Well, there's been Craig Umbaugh and a few others, and Gleason and those people were extremely instrumental. Because remember, they lived and breathed it 10, 12 hours a day, and John Lehigh, and in our small vacuum, those guys were critical. But there were a lot of critical pieces through all of this, to your point. If you would have dropped one little thing this small, it would have fallen apart. Could you have repeated it today? No, in my opinion. For whatever reason, it all fell in place, and everybody played a role to get it done.
Talking about hindsight and what you might do differently today, I know that when we started the legislation, there was no absolute clear signal that Major League Baseball was going to expand. They had talked about it. We certainly didn't know how much a franchise was going to cost. We certainly didn't know how much a stadium was going to cost. And one of the issues that we ran into in the legislature was when the bill got to the Senate, and Terry Considine, the senator carrying the bill, having a real estate background, believed vehemently that eminent domain should not be used for a project like this, which you all then ended up with a little bit of a challenge over home plate and the Copperthwaite family. How did you end up dealing with that?
I've mentally put that away. Not really. As you know, we never had to use we never had to condemn, and I philosophically agree with the senator. So it was a really hard battle for me internally, philosophically, but this was bigger than me philosophically, because I don't think that it should be driven by one person's political preference, but I was, being a real estate person, I'm not a big believer in condemnation for a wide variety of reasons. And I had many friends in the legislature that were ranchers and farmers that had that same belief. It worked itself out at the end of the day, though I had a total of 16 personal meetings with property owners I thought that we extended all the courtesies that we could afford to every property owner to get to a resolution that was fair and reasonable. And I think people would tell you that at the end of the day, it worked itself out. But that was a tough challenge. I'm sorry you brought that up. But there were, the legislative process was also helpful there. Tom Norton, the president of the Senate, we always had, for the most part, a good legislative relationship. Not entirely, because there were some political agendas that I didn't know that was coming our way, that we just sidebar from baseball, that we had to deal with. But in the end, I think it worked itself out. And I think a fair price was paid for all properties.
So you then have the responsibility of getting the stadium built, and you essentially had 3 years and 2 years at Mile High Stadium and 1 year before that roughly. So how did you get it done on time for opening day in 2015, and how did you get it done on budget?
Well, the truth is we didn't get it done on a timely basis. If you'll recall, we had the strike, which provided us an extra 3.5 to 4 weeks to get it really done. So the 2 exhibition games, as I recall, were with the Yankees, and they were pretty, we had a lot of internal problems that arose that we were able to correct. So we had, not that I'd like to put this on tape, we had 278 seats that were blocked that we didn't anticipate. So we tore down foul pole lines, we tore down different chairs. That never really came out, but we had enough of an issues that 3 weeks really was a godsend to us, and we were able to make it that much better. But as you'll recall, the ownership put quite a challenge on us when they added the 7,500 seats. So we were designing and building at the same time, which never is a good marriage, because eventually you run out of either money or time. And we could not run out of time.
So tell us about how you went from 40,000 to 50,000 seats.
Well, it then took on a whole life of its own, where we brought in more architects to do the design, with 100% of the cost being the burden of the team, which at the time, my math won't be totally right, but it's around 36 to 38 million that they wrote a check for the 7,500. And we kept on steam. I would say we kept on a pretty good line until we hit some heavy rains, and that really affected our project for about the last 5 or 6 months, but we were able to accomplish it. But I would give credit, if someone were to ask what was the greatest accomplishment, is we had 1,500 workers that had a great passion for this project. So I would walk the job at 5:30 in the morning with our project manager, and I couldn't wait to get out of that cold, freezing. And these are people that were, women and men, that were going to work on it for the next 8 or 10 or 12 hours. And the other most important thing is we didn't have a serious injury on the job. And did I lay awake at night about somebody losing their life or a limb? Yes. So would it be a burden I'd want to live with again? No. It was a very concerning, but I think that tells you the workforce that we had in Colorado. I don't need to go into the stories of fighting with the unions and a lot of other things that we had to tackle, but that was part of the process. The minority hiring, I'm proud of the fact that we were at 31% minority in women, and even though a certain mayor didn't agree with our minority count, it was nearly double the airport. There's a lot of internal victories that were realized that didn't need to be public. The bottom line is we had 20th Street going in, we had 23rd, we had nothing to do with either one of those. We got credit for all of that. So when you look at thousands of people of a force, a lot of people got 23rd Street done that we played zero role in. 20th Street got done, we played zero role in. So we had 3 projects, and you two know at the time, that was a mammoth project when you added the 3 together, and they all coordinated and all worked out well. Would that happen today? I don't know.
Well, you know, just talking about that subject for a moment, in those mammoth projects, we also had DIA and the Denver Public Library going at the same time. And there was some discussion about, was there going to be enough steel? Was there going to be enough concrete?
Right.
How did you guys deal with that?
I think we had a passion of the workforce and the contractors, candidly, that I think we were the top priority.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if that ended up happening that way, but we never had a shortage of product. And I think it was the fact that you had this pride with this workforce that really cared, that they wanted their signature on this building, that they wanted to bring their kids to see this building that they were part of. We had, I think, the first woman-owned steel company. And if you've ever been up on steel, I think you got to be a little crazy if you're a woman or a man. And I still remember some of those sidebar stories about people that worked on it. So I think it was an overall community effort that put us ahead. We did have a camera that ran 24/7 that was basically keeping track of us because of the airport. So did we have a lot of targets? Yes. At the end of the day, it worked itself out to where nobody got hurt. I think we followed all of the procedures, but I think the legislation drove it as a public-private, so there was no political influence on who was retained. And I think that's really important to note, because at the end of the day, there were business decisions made that you could keep independent. And once we didn't have elected officials on, I mean, when you think about what we had to deal with, we got a pretty good hand of cards that was laid out to us. So you can imagine if we were dealing with elected officials, even then it would have been better than it is today, likely. But with that said, we ran it like a business, even though we were held accountable to the state. And as you both know, we answered to everybody. We answered to the city councils, we answered to the mayors, the Senate, the House, you name it. The commissioners, everybody had a bite into us in some form or fashion. So our attitude was, we served everybody. So if somebody wanted to meet with us, we met with them. So if somebody wanted to talk to us about an issue, but when somebody wanted us to hire somebody, we didn't have to do that. And I think that's important to note if I were to look back on this, that you just basically made the best business decisions that you could at the time with the information you had. And keep in mind, not one of us had experience in building a stadium. So,
I appreciate.
Not many people do.
I appreciate your issues with the unions. The labor unions came to me and wanted it mandated in the legislation that it be union labor, or they would come out as a group against the election. So definitely pressure that you hope at the end of the day doesn't submarine you, but serves you well. One of the other challenges you had is a triceratops bones being found.
I thought it was a joke when I got a phone call at midnight and said that they found some bones, and I hung up on one of our guys that called us. And I think it was
Really?
either, yes, because I thought it was a joke. Because if you both remember, we were delayed. So we were far behind because of the land and far behind because of the negotiations. So I knew enough to be dangerous that we didn't have that many more months or we were going to be dead in the water. Thanks to HOK and thanks to Mortensen and the workforce, they were able to make up time, but you never want to start a project behind, and we started this project behind schedule. So with that said, here comes the bones, which we thought was actually a bad joke. They called me back at 12 o'clock and said, we're not kidding. And I said, tell me it's not human bones. And I think it was either Lehigh or Gleason who said, we're not sure, we don't know. So they had to take, I think it was probably 4 days, I thought it was 4 weeks to test it. And they came back and said it's dinosaurs. So I said, tell me our challenges. Fortunately, there wasn't that much of a challenge per se on delay, but did it cause another issue? Yes. But it was actually a blip, and we were able to work through it. We were also on tribal grounds, so we were dealing with some issues as it relates to some of the reservations, and Tom did a masterful job of that and said, Ray, they want to bless the site. I said, I'm all for anybody blessing the site in any religion. And they all came, and there was 800. And
800?
Yeah, 800,
Wow.
all dressed. Basically in what I would say the ceremony of death, because it was on the river, if you'll recall. So this was their burial ground from the standpoint of how they would bless the ceremony. So I do remember that because I came down and I thought it would literally be two people and myself and Tom. There ended up being an unbelievable
Wow.
cast that was impressive. So there were these different issues that is, you said if there was one blip, it would be gone. I mean, I don't know how it was going to play out on the land. I didn't know how the unions, by the way, came out against the stadium vote. And as you know, we were paying prevailing wage anyway, so we were at 90-some%. And again, that helped carry the day. We didn't have to deal with Davis-Bacon. Now I'm being a bit political, but that would have cost us more time. So from those little, you look back at them, they look minor. They weren't minor at the time. They were big crises. Gleason was a critical piece to this, because when Gleason was asked to come on board, there was a lot of political chaos going on at the time. And there was a lot of uncertainty on what was going to happen. And Gleason was a godsend, because he was the #1 first employee ever hired. And he took it on because it was likely, you would have to ask him why, but I begged him to do it, and he was the single most important piece at the time. If Tom hadn't have been there, I don't know what kind of district court we would have had and what type of timing we would have had. And then there became more critical pieces, like John Lehigh was critical because we brought in a great engineer that knew how to deal with schedule. We brought in Charlie Nicolai that did all the infrastructure, and then things got luckier as you went along. And then you look at the hand we were dealt on the ownership, didn't really have a mammoth effect on us because we were too chaotic as it was with what our challenges were. But it still got to the right conclusion.
So during that 3-year period, you must have worked on this full-time. At least full-time.
It took a little bit more of it, just because you'd have these blips of issues. But once you start a project, it's really almost out of your control because it's with the contractor. But, you know, Steve Halverson was critical with Mortensen. I mean, he had a penalty in there. We had a penalty on him that if he were late, he had to pay us, I think it was $250,000 for every game he missed. He didn't waive that. And we said, hey, we're causing you this issue because we're adding on $7,500. And he said, it doesn't matter. We're going to get it done. Because he said,
Wow.
I'm dead, you're dead, we got to have it done. So there were all these thousands of people that played a role in it. I mean, we were a microscope at it at the time, but then we were forgotten, which I think is a reflection of good work. Nobody remembers what you did or how you did it. So at the end of the day, we didn't have an egotistical board, and I think that was important, just get the job done. And you look at these appointees, they were the luck of the draw. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, I was a compromise appointee, not that I added the value that Max or these guys did, but, you know, we wouldn't have baseball without John DeCue. We wouldn't have baseball without Hauserman. We wouldn't have baseball without the baseball commission. It goes on and on and on. So when you try to explain that to another city, you know, there's not enough time in the day to explain it to them. I try to tell them, you just can't look at the baseball lease. It's far more wide than that. It goes back 30-some years. So people have a hard time comprehending that. Were there staggering times? Sure. When we thought baseball would be a $40 million franchise, it came out to be 92. Who would have thought that we would sacrifice the naming rights? I mean, looking back, you still had to do it, or we wouldn't have baseball today.
Right.
And were we worried 3 years ago that baseball would leave Colorado? Probably not likely, but we also didn't think Atlanta would move their stadium. I mean, there was crazy things that happened, though we were never threatened by anybody on the Rockies side to move the team. Crazier things have happened. The Raiders have been in 3 cities.
Right.
So I didn't want to be part of that, and our board didn't want to be part of that. So at the end of the day, if you looked at all the bombs that were thrown at us at different times, I think this is the nature of 30 months. And you just dealt with whatever came. But you are who you surround yourself with. And the young talented 26-year-old to Steve Halverson to, it goes on and on and on about how you would appreciate whoever got you to the finish line to get it done. Off the record, did I have to deal with some political issues? Yes. That's off the record. So, did I have a love affair with the mayor? No.
Maybe not.
But we also got we agreed to disagree. And in fairness, he never got in our way at the end of the day. And I think he saw it as a bigger picture. Do I think we'd have riverfront? No. And that also played to our benefit with the mayor. So, you know, Mayor Pena and Mayor Webb and Romer and you and Considine, think of putting all those together in one room and saying, we're going to make something out of this. Not likely.
Not likely.
And it worked itself out. And remember, we had to deal with city council. So, I mean, it went on and on. Then we had county commissioners that were against it. And no names need to be mentioned. But they were upset that their site wasn't picked. Then I had to remind them that we never had a site outside Denver. It's hard to pick a site if you don't submit. And as you'll recall, the ULI was critical. And that was in the legislation, that who would have thought that ULI could come to town. But they gave us tremendous coverage and, I think, tremendous asset of helping us evaluate the sites. If we didn't have that, I don't know what problems that would have created. So that was a great, what I would say, credibility cover for us. Because you didn't have a board that really had experience on picking a site.
Right.
I mean, nobody had looked at and I'm not being detrimental to our other board members, but I didn't have any expertise in it. And then look at the site that was ultimately picked for all the wrong reasons or all the right reasons, that included 20th Street, included Auraria being done, and included 23rd. I call that luck.
Right.
And it all fell into place, and a lot of people get credit for that. Too many to mention.
So how did you feel when you walked into the stadium and watched your first few games there?
I just, through this whole 25 years, Neil, I have felt relieved. I haven't really felt ecstatic because I think it's a part of community effort. Did I think I'd still be here today? No. Am I proud of what's done? I'm proud of the boards. The board membership, if you look over it all, were incredible. So I think you do community service because who you get to be associated with. So I would call it relieved more than ecstatic. And it got relieved in the fact that you'd lay awake at night thinking you forgot about women's restrooms, or you forgot about this, or somebody would get hurt. So I think the most fulfilling thing is nobody got hurt. That was the most satisfying. And the work ethic, but the collaboration of the thousands make it a team effort. We were asked by Arizona about, well, what is the greatest single credit? Candidly, the greatest single credit, besides the people, was the legislative directive, because it gave us the cover that
Right.
we could run this non-political. And actually, and it fell into football. Football was considerably easier.
You know,
So you have been involved in getting in baseball outside of Coors Field. What have you done there?
Well, a lot of cities gave back to us, and we've given back a lot. I'd like to think to other municipalities. We've met with numerous cities about the legislative intent, which I think the law speaks for itself, but more importantly, part of the process that goes through. And you can never sit down with somebody that really can appreciate the, as I call it, kind of the 40 years of it all. So I don't know that we've added a lot of value, but there's not many mistakes that I would look back on that our designer made or that the team hasn't done. I wish it wasn't 50.
But haven't you been involved in some Little League ballparks?
Yes, we've done that, which is, I mean, the foundation that we've created got to benefit from baseball and got to benefit from community efforts, which has been great. And from that standpoint, I think it served itself well, because we served the 7 counties with our foundation. So it kind of duplicated itself. 6 counties at the time. We did irritate Broomfield. And I didn't know that we could irritate a county that wasn't a county, but we did. So, and that was a whole new story. But But as far as tweaks to it, I don't know that there's too many things that just didn't fall in place due to everybody at the end of the day.
You know, you've talked about luck, and one of the things that Paul Jacobs indicated to us in his story was how Major League Baseball, when they came out to do their visits to Colorado, were very specific about not having a public demonstration. And of course, we ended up having a very large public demonstration at the United Bank building. And one of the Major League owners said, "We told you not to do this, but I think you did the right thing." What kind of role did you all, as the Stadium Authority, play in those meetings where Major League Baseball interaction?
You know, my perception at the time is that our role was really limited to the fact of, could we get this job done? And I don't think the way the intent was laid out, it was really for somebody else to carry that campaign, which I think was smart at the time because it didn't create what I would say perceived conflicts. And so I think from that standpoint, we were really there for one simple observation, is they're capable enough to start it and to finish it. And so our role, I think, was credibility and only credibility only. And I think that it probably served the purpose, but as you'll recall, we were prohibited from being part of the campaign, which at the time you would question because hopefully we were going to know more about the site and everything else. But at the time, it all worked itself out with that provision. And we weren't really thrown into, I guess, the lion's den of being in the middle of those issues. So when you looked at the bid, I think people understood that that was a check that they could say, yes, it can get built. And it'll get built, on a right schedule and a right budget. And at the end of the day, I think that was a simple check. There was a lot of other issues before that had to play.
So when Major League Baseball came out, had you all selected a site, or were we still narrowed down to 3?
I think at the time we still had 3, but a lot of years have passed that I remember that. Because really John played a much bigger role at that time than I did. My role really never stepped up until after John left. And then it took on its own different set of issues that we had to deal with.
So what role do you think the stadium has played in the redevelopment of Lower Downtown?
I would say the basis was there, and I think the infrastructure has been underrated, not overrated. I think if people have a bad traffic and access and ingress experience, they don't come back. That's pretty proven. So with that said, I think there was 20th and 23rd Street played, I think, a gigantic role. We had very little to do with that, meaning the board itself. So I think there was found luck there. Auraria had just gotten completed, and Auraria is a big feed, as you know. But 23rd Street at the time, I think the Rockies would tell you that 35 or 40% of the season ticket holders came from the north. So that's a gigantic way in on, I call it 23rd, it's really 38th, but from that standpoint, I think that played a big role. How much of a role, as you know, in the economic development studies, they were underestimated by double. I think the chamber estimated 40-some million tax benefit. It ended up being 90 now. I don't know what it would be today. When we had the public hearing to select the site, we had 2 people show up to talk about the site. And the reason we only had 2 people is nobody lived in the neighborhood. As you two would recall, nobody lived around us. And as you know, a lot of the homeless people didn't come to the public meetings. So people have a hard time understanding why 20th ever came with any controversy. But you two would recall, there wasn't a lot of support for 20th and Blake. And that's where I think the price worked. We had $12 million for land. That's what the price was. So I think that's just dumb luck. And there were other pieces that were high priced. I'm not saying they weren't worth it, but they were high priced and we couldn't afford them.
And if this had happened 5 years later, the prices would have
Oh.
escalated to a point where you couldn't have done it.
If any blip would have happened, it wouldn't have happened, is what I would say. And
So it was helpful that we were in a recession at the time you bought that property, huh?
I think Union Pacific wanted to sell it, and as you know, we dealt with some property owners, but we only had 8, and we never used condemnation, and 7 were a layup, because I think we treated them right and properly, not overly right, but properly. And being one member of the board, and I wasn't the only one against condemnation, we wouldn't have asked for it if we couldn't have bought off an appraisal. But with that said, that also fell in play. As you'll recall, that happened at the last minute in the session. And ranchers and farmers supported us throwing up. I don't know how that would have played out today. And by the way, it wasn't Democrat or Republican.
Right.
So, you know, you had to be pretty chummy with the Democrat governor. Who would have thought?
Yeah.
I mean, so you look back through all that. And the only reason this is fresh in my mind, which it is really fresh, is Arizona. Because they're suing each other and fighting and arguing, and it's a bloodbath, and they think ours is the model, which I've said, we had an economy that went our way and the land's worth a lot of money. So things went well for us, or went well for the whole community.
One of the comments that I heard on talk radio was, you guys are going to build a white elephant, nobody's going to come to a baseball game. This is a football
Yes.
town. And of course, whenever you go to opening day or many games, you see that all of Lodo is just absolutely full of people. Did you have doubts that it would be successful or that baseball would make it in Colorado?
I don't know that I really had doubts that it would make it. I had doubts about how successful it would be. And you're being generous that it's Lodo, because it's really the whole community.
Right.
Because basically, if schools could close, they would. Which, by the way, an opening day at Broncos doesn't produce the same results.
Wow.
So when you really think about what the atmosphere it created and how much it spurred lower downtown, I think is self-serving for us to comment because the site was picked. But with that said, I think it's certainly a catalyst. It was part of it. But the charm of lower downtown was already there, and we were able to copy that. So I think a lot of local people had a big influence on our basically what I'd say is our exterior look. I didn't have that vision. And I don't know that anybody on our board really had the vision other than to say that sounds like a good idea. So I would call that a bit of luck. And if you look at the brick today, it's the standard for ballparks. And it wasn't Baltimore. We used our own exterior look for this. And I think at the time it was the largest masonry job in the history of Colorado.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Which of course was extremely helpful in the Hispanic and Latino community because they basically did it. So there's a lot of pluses that indirectly benefited us in a bigger way than people realize. And I think that, the team's commitment to honoring that facility, they would probably reluctantly admit to you that people came just for the facility when they weren't winning as many games. I mean, not that there is a difference between 2-6 and 2-8 in draw, but it is only 200. And they would still come if they lost 90 games. But I think that's a credit to Lodo too. And I think it all kind of played off each other. And the mayor deserves credit for that. I mean, Wellington did a lot to keep improving lower downtown. And I think that that's played off. I never thought it would be anywhere near this. I didn't have the vision.
So do you have any final thoughts about your experience?
No. I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's kind of like the village carries the day. And I think that's what happened here. I mean, when you look at, as I would say, probably not on air, but it was built half-assed backwards. I mean, we had to start from the outside to the end because of the land, and everybody said it will never be done. you can't build it from the outside in, and we started building from the outside toward home plate because we couldn't get the land. So there were a lot of things that looked like old gigantic obstacles that smarter people than our board made work. I'd give credit to the 1,500 workers probably more than anybody, because there wasn't ever lack of motivation, and we were never going to be late. It may not be completely done, but we were never going to be late. So I think it was a mammoth win all over again that I don't know that could be repeated.
Great, thank
Well,
you, Ray.
Thank you so much for all that you've done on this project.
Well, thank you for, I appreciate you more each year when I read the legislation than what we've had to deal with, or what we could have dealt with. And it actually went a long way as it relates to football. Because as you know, they just mirrored the copy of it.
Well, I think a lot of credit goes to